The unlikely encounter. The afternoon sun bathed the bustling city streets in golden light. James Harrison, a seasoned FBI agent, adjusted his worn leather jacket as he blended seamlessly into the crowd. His deep brown eyes scanned his surroundings with practiced ease. Today was meant to be a low-profile surveillance mission. Track a suspected arms dealer and gather enough evidence to build a solid case. After years of infiltrating criminal networks, James had learned the art of invisibility in plain sight. This was supposed to be routine, he thought, but something in his gut told him otherwise. His instincts, honed by years of experience, rarely failed him. Dressed inconspicuously in a plain white shirt and faded jeans, he could have been mistaken for any other pedestrian. But beneath his calm exterior, James was a man on high alert, his mind a web of calculations, analyzing every movement around him. The city pulsed with life. Street vendors peddled their wares. Cars honked in the distance, and pedestrians hurried past, their faces a mixture of focus and fatigue. James adjusted his earpiece subtly, listening to the chatter from his team stationed nearby. Target in sight. A voice crackled through the line. "He's heading south on Grand Avenue." "Copy that," James muttered under his breath, his tone measured. His eyes locked onto a tall man in a dark hoodie and sneakers weaving through the crowd. The target was making his way toward a rendezvous point, a suspected exchange location. James maintained a casual pace, keeping a safe distance while noting every detail: the way the man scanned his surroundings, the weighty duffel bag slung over his shoulder. But just as James turned a corner to follow, the rumble of an approaching patrol car broke his focus. The vehicle slowed to a crawl, its occupants scanning the crowd with intent. Two officers sat inside, their uniforms crisp but their demeanor sharp. Officers Daniels and Green were new recruits in a precinct notorious for its issues with racial profiling and excessive force. James noticed their eyes linger on him longer than necessary. He ignored the car at first, focusing on his target. But as he continued down the street, the patrol car edged closer. Finally, a voice called out, firm and commanding. "Hey, you, stop right there." James paused, his body instantly tensing. This wasn't part of the plan. Slowly, he turned to face the officers. His mind raced, not with panic, but with the cold logic that had kept him alive through countless operations. The crowd began to thin as onlookers instinctively stepped aside, sensing tension in the air. "Is there a problem, officers?" James asked, his voice calm but tinged with a sharpness that conveyed his lack of patience. Daniels stepped out of the car, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. "We got a report of a suspicious individual matching your description," he said, his tone clipped. "Description?" James raised an eyebrow. He knew where this was going but decided to give them the benefit of the doubt. For now. "What exactly is that description?" "White shirt, jeans," Daniels replied, his eyes narrowing as if daring James to contradict him. "And you're looking around like you've got something to hide." James resisted the urge to roll his eyes. "You mean looking around like a normal pedestrian?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with irritation. "Officers, I assure you, there's been a mistake. I'm in the middle off." "Save it," interrupted Green, stepping out of the passenger side. His gaze was cold, dismissive. "We've seen your type before. Hands where we can see them." James felt the familiar sting of frustration bubble under his calm exterior. "My type," he repeated under his breath, his jaw tightening. But he complied, raising his hand slowly to avoid further provocation. The last thing he needed was a public confrontation that could compromise his mission. As the officers approached, James glanced at the crowd that had started to gather. Faces reflected a mixture of curiosity and unease. A few had their phones out, already recording the encounter. The situation was spiraling faster than he could control. "Look," James began, keeping his tone measured, "I'm an FBI agent. If you'll let me." Daniel snorted, cutting him off. "Yeah. And I'm the mayor," he said with a smirk. "Turn around." "You're coming with us." James hesitated. His badge was tucked safely in his jacket pocket, but he knew flashing it now would only escalate the situation. The officers had already made up their minds. They saw only what they wanted to see: a black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. "Officers, please," he tried again. "If you'll just turn around," Daniels barked, pulling out his handcuffs. The cold metal snapped around James's wrists with a finality that sent a ripple through the onlookers. Gasps of disbelief mixed with murmurs of disapproval. James locked eyes with a woman in the crowd who held up her phone, her expression one of outrage. As the officers led him toward their patrol car, James's mind raced. He couldn't blow his cover, not with his target just a block away. But he also couldn't let this farce continue. Every second wasted here was another second the arms dealer slipped further out of reach. The door of the patrol car slammed shut behind him, and James found himself sitting in the back seat, his hands cuffed and his mission hanging by a thread. Through the window, he could see the crowd's faces pressed against the glass. Phones recorded every second of his humiliation. Taking a deep breath, he forced himself to focus. He wasn't just a man in cuffs. He was James Harrison, an FBI agent with the skills and experience to navigate even the most impossible situations. And this was just another challenge. "Officers," he called out, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "Check my jacket pocket. You'll find my badge." Daniels scoffed. "Nice try," he said, turning his back. "Save your lies for the station." James leaned back, his eyes narrowing. They weren't going to listen. Not yet. But soon enough, they'd have no choice. As he sat in the patrol car, surrounded by a crowd hungry for answers, he began to formulate a plan, a way to turn the tables and ensure justice was served. Little did the officers know, they hadn't just arrested a random man. They had unwittingly stepped into a storm that would expose not only their biases, but the flaws of a system that allowed such injustices to persist. And James, he was ready to face it head-on. A battle of wills. James sat in the back seat of the patrol car, his wrists raw from the cuffs biting into his skin. The hum of the city outside felt distant, muffled by the rising noise of his thoughts. Years of training had conditioned him to stay calm under pressure, but the absurdity of this situation pushed the limits of his patience. He needed to tread carefully. His mission, the tracking of a dangerous arms dealer, was hanging by a thread. But so was something larger. The principle that he, a man who had dedicated his life to justice, was now being publicly humiliated simply because of the color of his skin. The officers, Daniels and Green, stood a few feet away, exchanging words James couldn't hear. Their postures were stiff, defensive, as if they knew they were losing control of the situation, but refused to acknowledge it. The crowd outside had grown larger, their murmurs a constant backdrop. James could see the phones aimed at him, capturing every humiliating moment. From his seat, he noticed the woman who had called out earlier, holding her phone high. Her defiance was evident in her stance, her voice slicing through the air as she argued with the officers. "You've got the wrong guy. I saw the thief. He ran past me. He's wearing a hoodie." Her words were sharp, unapologetic. Daniel's irritation was palpable as he turned to her, his voice carrying an edge of authority. "Ma'am, please step back. We're handling this." But she wasn't intimidated. "Handling this," she repeated, incredulous. "By arresting an innocent man while the real criminal gets away. I've got it all on video. You're making a huge mistake." James watched the interaction unfold, his respect for the woman growing. Her courage to challenge authority in a moment like this was rare, and it gave him a flicker of hope. Yet, he knew that hope alone wouldn't resolve this. He needed to act, but he had to do it without blowing his cover. Taking a deep breath, he leaned forward, his voice calm but commanding. "Officers," he called out. His tone cut through the noise, drawing their attention. "Check my inside jacket pocket. There's something there that might clear this up." Daniels turned to face him, his expression a mixture of irritation and suspicion. "What are you playing at?" he asked, his hand still hovering near his holster. James kept his gaze steady. "No games. Just check. You might find my credentials in there." Green glanced at Daniels, his brow furrowed. "What's the harm in checking?" he muttered. "If he's lying, it won't change anything." Daniels hesitated, then let out a frustrated sigh. "Fine. But if this is some kind of stunt, you'll regret it." Green opened the car door, his movements cautious. James stayed still, his hands resting in his lap as Green reached into his jacket pocket. When he pulled out the black leather badge holder, his expression shifted almost instantly. He flipped it open, revealing the unmistakable gold shield of an FBI agent. "Daniels." Green's voice trailed off, his face pale. He's telling the truth." Daniels snatched the badge, his eyes scanning it with disbelief. For a moment, his arrogance faltered, replaced by an unmistakable mix of panic and shame. The crowd sensed the shift, their murmurs growing louder. Phones zoomed in, capturing the officers' stunned reactions. James leaned back, watching their realization unfold. "I told you," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of restrained anger. "I'm an FBI agent on an active mission, and because of your assumptions, that mission is now at risk." Daniel's mouth opened, then closed, as if he couldn't find the words. Green looked at the crowd, his discomfort obvious. "We didn't know," he stammered. "We thought." "You thought wrong," James cut in sharply. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze piercing. "And let's be clear, you didn't listen. I told you from the beginning, but you were too blinded by your assumptions to hear me." Daniels fumbled with the cuffs, his hands trembling slightly as he worked to release James. The click of the cuffs unlocking was followed by a silence that hung heavy in the air. James rubbed his wrists, his expression unreadable as he stepped out of the car. The crowd erupted. Some clapped, others cheered, and a few shouted at the officers, demanding accountability. James raised a hand, signaling for quiet. His calm presence commanded attention, and the crowd slowly stilled. "This," he began, his voice steady, "is bigger than just me. Today, I was lucky. I had proof of who I am. But how many others don't get that chance? How many others are judged, stopped, or worse, because of the way they look?" His words hung in the air, resonating with the crowd. The woman who had spoken up earlier stepped forward, her phone still recording. "Thank you," James said to her, his tone softening. "Your courage made a difference." She nodded, her expression a mix of relief and determination. Someone had to say something. Daniels and Green stood to the side, their faces a portrait of shame. They looked at James, clearly searching for a way to apologize, to explain. But James wasn't interested in their excuses. "You too," he said, turning to them, "need to do better. Not just for me, but for everyone you're sworn to protect. Your bias almost derailed an FBI mission. Let that sink in." Green swallowed hard, his head nodding slightly. Daniels remained silent, his gaze fixed on the ground. James turned to the crowd one last time. "Let's not let this moment go to waste. Hold people accountable. Speak up when you see injustice. And remember, change starts with us." The crowd erupted into applause, their energy electric. As James walked away, his mind was already racing with the next steps. His mission wasn't over, and now he had a new layer of complexity to navigate. But he was determined. This wasn't just about catching an arms dealer anymore. It was about standing up against a system that had allowed this kind of behavior to persist for far too long. As he disappeared into the crowd, blending back into the rhythm of the city, one thing was clear. James Harrison wasn't just an agent. He was a force for change, and his mission was far from finished. A mission on the brink. James moved quickly through the bustling streets, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The humiliation he had just endured burned within him, but he couldn't afford to let it cloud his focus. His mission was still in play, and every second counted. The arms dealer he had been tailing was likely on the move, and James couldn't let him slip away. He adjusted the jacket that now felt heavier than usual, his FBI badge tucked safely back inside. The cuffs had left red marks on his wrists, but he ignored the stinging pain. There was no time for reflection. He activated the small earpiece in his ear, his voice calm but firm. "Team, this is Harrison. I'm back on the move. Any updates on the target?" A crackle of static followed before a familiar voice responded. "Harrison, we lost visual on him near 12th and Broadway. He was heading east, but the area's crowded. We got 2 agents sweeping nearby. What's your ETA?" "5 minutes," James replied, weaving through the crowd. His trained eyes scanned the streets, searching for any sign of his target. He passed vendors hawking their goods, street performers drawing small crowds, and the occasional curious onlooker who seemed to recognize him from the earlier confrontation with the police. He ignored their stares, focusing instead on the task at hand. The air was thick with the noise of the city, car horns blaring, chatter from pedestrians, and the occasional siren in the distance. James's instincts were on high alert, his training kicking in as he pieced together potential escape routes his target might have taken. The arms dealer, a man known only as Victor, was a ghost in the underworld, a man who moved with precision, always staying one step ahead. Catching him today would take more than just skill. It would take every ounce of focus James could muster. As he approached the intersection of 12th and Broadway, James slowed his pace, blending into the crowd. He scanned the area methodically, his eyes sweeping over every face, every movement. The street was alive with activity, a bustling market, tourists snapping photos, and locals going about their routines. It was the perfect cover for someone like Victor. "Team, I'm at the intersection," James murmured into his earpiece. "Do we have eyes on him?" "Negative," came the reply. But a contact just reported seeing someone matching his description near a black van parked in the alley behind Main Street. "Could be our guy." James turned toward Main Street, his pace quickening. He moved with purpose, his mind running through possible scenarios. If Victor was near the van, it could mean a handoff was imminent. This was a rare opportunity, one James couldn't afford to miss. As he approached the alley, the bustling noise of the main street gave way to an eerie quiet. The narrow passage was lined with dumpsters, graffiti-covered walls, and shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. James slowed his pace, his senses sharp. He pressed a hand to the concealed holster at his side, ensuring his weapon was within reach. The black van came into view, its engine idling softly. 2 men stood near the back, their postures tense as they exchanged words James couldn't hear. One of them matched Victor's description, tall, lean, and dressed in a dark hoodie. The other was broader, his face partially obscured by a baseball cap. "Visual on the target," James whispered. "Victor's at the van with an unknown accomplice. Looks like they're prepping for a handoff." "Roger that," the voice in his earpiece replied. "Backup is en route. ETA 3 minutes. Hold position and don't engage until we're in place." James's jaw tightened. 3 minutes might as well have been an eternity in a situation like this. Anything could happen. Victor could spot him, make the exchange, and vanish into the labyrinth of the city before backup arrived. James made a split-second decision. "Negative," he said firmly. "I'm moving in. I'll keep it quiet." "James, wait." But he was already moving. Years of training had taught him how to navigate high-stakes situations, and this was no different. He approached the van silently, using the shadows as cover. His heartbeat was steady, his breathing controlled. Every step was calculated, his focus unshakable. As he neared the van, he caught snippets of the conversation between Victor and his accomplice. "Shipment's clean," the broader man said, his voice low and gravelly. "But we need to move fast. Cops are crawling all over the area." "Relax," Victor replied, his tone cold and detached. "They don't know a thing. Once we're done here, we're ghosts. James inched closer, his hand resting on his weapon. He could see the duffel bag now, unzipped to reveal an assortment of firearms and ammunition. This was it, the proof he needed to take Victor down. But he had to act fast. In one swift motion, James stepped into the light, his weapon drawn. FBI. He barked, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Hands in the air. Now. The reaction was instantaneous. Victor's eyes widened in shock, but his accomplice was quicker, reaching for a weapon concealed at his hip. James fired a warning shot into the air, the deafening crack echoing through the alley. "Don't even think about it," James growled, his weapon trained on the accomplice. "Hands where I can see them. Both of you." The broader man hesitated, his hand hovering near his weapon, but Victor raised his hand slowly, a smirk playing on his lips. "You've got guts," Victor said, his tone mocking. "But you're outnumbered. What's your play here, Agent?" James didn't flinch. "The play is you in cuffs and your little operation shut down for good. Now, get on the ground. Both of you." For a moment, it seemed like Victor might comply. But then, out of the corner of his eye, James saw movement, a shadow shifting in the periphery. A third man emerged from behind a dumpster, a knife glinting in his hand. James reacted instinctively, pivoting and firing in one fluid motion. The bullet struck the man in the shoulder, sending him crashing to the ground with a cry of pain. The distraction gave Victor and his accomplice an opening. The broader man lunged for the duffel bag, while Victor bolted toward the van. James fired again, hitting the accomplice in the leg and sending him sprawling. But Victor was already behind the wheel, the van roaring to life. James sprinted after him, his feet pounding against the pavement. He aimed for the tires, firing off 2 quick shots. The van swerved violently, crashing into a stack of crates before coming to a halt. James closed the distance, yanking open the driver's side door and dragging Victor out. "You're done," James said, slamming Victor against the side of the van. The man struggled, but James was stronger, pinning him with ease. He pulled out his cuffs, snapping them onto Victor's wrists with a finality that echoed through the alley. As backup arrived, sirens wailing in the distance, James stood over Victor, his chest rising and falling with exertion. The mission was complete, but the weight of the day's events hung heavy on him. He had done his job, but the earlier injustice still lingered in his mind. This was far from over. For James, justice wasn't just about catching criminals. It was about fighting for a system that treated everyone fairly. And that fight was only just beginning. After the storm, the alley buzzed with activity as backup units swarmed the scene. Sirens wailed, their piercing cries fading into the cacophony of voices and the crackle of police radios. James Harrison stood near the black van, his breath steady but his mind far from calm. Around him, agents and officers worked quickly, securing evidence, detaining suspects, and cordoning off the area. Victor, the arms dealer James had been pursuing, sat on the ground in handcuffs, his face impassive despite the chaos. A duffel bag full of illegal weapons lay at his feet, a damning testament to his operation. James had caught him, but the victory felt hollow. The earlier confrontation with the 2 police officers still lingered in his mind, an ugly reminder of the systemic flaws he had witnessed far too often. "Agent Harrison," a voice called, pulling him from his thoughts. James turned to see his team leader, Special Agent Karen Monroe, striding toward him. Her sharp gaze flickered over the scene, taking in every detail. She stopped in front of James, crossing her arms. "Nice work," she said, her tone brisk. "Victor's been on our radar for months, and you managed to bring him in before he could slip away. But I heard there was a complication." James hesitated, his jaw tightening. He debated how much to reveal. Karen was a solid leader, someone he trusted, but reliving the earlier incident wasn't something he wanted to do right now. "Complication is one way to put it," he replied, keeping his voice even. "2 local officers detained me before I could make the arrest. It delayed things, but I handled it. Karen's eyes narrowed. Detained you? On what grounds? James met her gaze, his expression stoic. They didn't like the way I looked. Claimed I matched the description of a suspect. They ignored my credentials until it was too late. Karen's face hardened, her professional demeanor slipping just enough to reveal the anger simmering beneath. Unbelievable, she muttered. And yet not surprising. I'll make sure this gets reported. Those officers need to be held accountable. James nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. The crowd that had gathered during his wrongful arrest had likely captured everything on video. The footage would circulate, drawing attention to an issue he'd been grappling with his entire career. He had spent years fighting criminals, but systemic bias was a battle that felt infinitely more complex and deeply personal. Karen seemed to sense his distraction. "Harrison," she said, her voice softer now, "you did everything right. Victor's in custody, and his operation is effectively dismantled. Don't let those officers' incompetence overshadow your work today." James offered her a faint smile, but her words did little to ease the weight on his shoulders. He glanced at Victor, who was being loaded into a police vehicle. The man met James's gaze, a slow smirk spreading across his face. "You think this is over, Agent?" Victor called out, his voice dripping with defiance. "You've just scratched the surface. There are others, bigger than me. Oh, keep this going. You can't stop it." James stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but you won't be part of it. Enjoy your time behind bars." Victor's smirk faltered, but he said nothing more as the vehicle's doors slammed shut. James turned away, his focus shifting back to the task at hand. The team was wrapping up, the alley slowly clearing as evidence was cataloged and suspects transported. Just as James was about to leave, the same woman who had defended him earlier appeared at the edge of the scene. Her phone was still in her hand, her expression a mix of relief and concern. She caught James's eye and hesitated before stepping closer. "Agent Harrison?" she asked tentatively. James nodded, his expression softening. "That's me. And you are?" "Danielle Carter," she said, offering a small smile. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for what happened earlier. Those officers, what they did was wrong. I couldn't just stand by and let it happen." James studied her for a moment, noting the determination in her eyes. "You did more than most would," he said sincerely. "Your voice made a difference. Thank you." Danielle shifted on her feet, clearly debating whether to say more. "Finally," she added, "I recorded everything. The way they treated you, how they ignored your credentials. It's all on my phone. I don't know if you want it, but I thought you should know." James's jaw tightened. The idea of reliving that humiliating encounter didn't sit well with him, but he also knew the power of evidence. The footage could spark a larger conversation, one that went beyond his personal experience. "Hold on to it," he said after a moment. "For now. But if you're willing, I might need it later." Danielle nodded, her expression resolute. "Anything I can do to help, just let me know." As she walked away, James felt a flicker of hope amid the frustration. People like Danielle reminded him that change was possible, even if it came slowly. Karen approached him again, her phone in hand. "We've got a debrief scheduled back at the office," she said. "You ready?" James took a deep breath, the weight of the day settling on him. "Yeah," he replied. "Let's go." Back at the FBI field office, the mood was tense. The successful apprehension of Victor was overshadowed by the earlier incident with the police. James sat at a long table in the briefing room, surrounded by his colleagues. Karen stood at the front, her sharp voice cutting through the silence as she recounted the mission's details. When she reached the part about James's detention, her tone grew colder. "Two local officers detained one of our agents without cause," she said, her gaze sweeping the room. "Their actions delayed the operation and could have jeopardized the entire mission. This is unacceptable, and it will be addressed." The room murmured in agreement, But James remained quiet. He wasn't interested in hearing platitudes or empty promises. He wanted action, real, tangible change. After the debrief, Karen pulled him aside. "I've already contacted Internal Affairs," she said. "They'll be looking into those officers, and I've reached out to the precinct commander. He's expecting a formal complaint from us." James nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He had spent his entire career fighting for justice, yet today's events had reminded him how far there was still to go. The fight wasn't just against criminals. It was against a system that too often failed the people it was meant to protect. As he left the office that evening, the weight of the day pressed heavy on him. But he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't done fighting. Not by a long shot. The unfinished fight. The next morning, James Harrison sat at his kitchen table, the rising sun casting warm streaks of light through the window. A steaming cup of coffee sat untouched in front of him, his focus on the tablet screen glowing with news headlines. FBI agent detained by local police in mistaken arrest. Racial profiling incident sparks outrage after video goes viral. Federal agent's mission nearly compromised by local law enforcement bias. The headlines were everywhere. The video Danielle Carter had recorded had spread like wildfire, shared across social media platforms, and picked up by major news outlets. Comment sections were ablaze with debates about race, authority, and justice. Some applauded James for his composure and professionalism. Others fixated on the officer's actions, their incompetence becoming a symbol of deeper systemic issues. James sighed, running a hand over his face. He had spent the night piecing together a report for Internal Affairs, recounting every moment of the encounter with Daniels and Green. Reliving the experience had been exhausting, the memory fresh and raw. But he knew the importance of getting every detail right. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about holding a broken system accountable. His phone buzzed on the table, pulling him from his thoughts. The name on the screen read Karen Monroe. "Morning, Karen," James said as he answered. "Morning, James," Karen replied, her tone clipped but not unkind. "I'm sure you've seen the news by now." "I have," James said, his voice even. "It's everywhere." "That's putting it mildly," Karen said with a dry chuckle. "Internal Affairs is moving fast on this. Daniels and Green have been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation, and the police chief has already issued a public statement about reviewing training protocols." James leaned back in his chair, his lips pressing into a thin line. "It's a start," he said, though the words felt hollow. "But this can't just be about damage control. It needs to be real." Karen's tone softened. "I know. And I think this is an opportunity to push for something bigger. The Bureau is watching closely, James. They've seen how you handled this, and they're impressed. There's talk of you leading a task force, something focused on addressing systemic bias in law enforcement." James blinked, caught off guard. "A task force?" "Yes," Karen confirmed. "It's still in the early stages, but they want someone who understands the issues firsthand. Someone who can balance the mission with the bigger picture. And James, that someone is you." The weight of her words settled on James. He had spent years focusing on dismantling criminal organizations, diving headfirst into dangerous missions without hesitation. This was different. This was an opportunity to challenge the system from the inside, to fight for the kind of change he had always believed in. "I'll think about it," James said finally, his tone cautious. "But right now, I need to focus on the fallout from yesterday. There's still work to be done." "Fair enough," Karen said. "But don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't come often." After ending the call, James sat in silence, the enormity of the decision weighing on him. A task force could be a powerful tool for change, but it would also mean stepping away from the work he was most familiar with. Could he make a difference in this new role? Would it be enough? His thoughts were interrupted by another buzz from his phone. This time, it was a message from Danielle Carter. "The footage is sparking a lot of conversation. If you need me to testify or help in any way, I'm here." James couldn't help but smile. Her determination reminded him of why this fight mattered. He quickly typed a reply. "Thank you, Danielle. Your courage started something important. I'll let you know if we need your help." Later that day, James found himself back at the precinct where Daniels and Green were stationed. The air inside was thick with tension as he stepped through the doors, his presence drawing the attention of every officer in the room. Conversations hushed, and a few exchanged uneasy glances. James ignored them, his focus on the reason he was there. The precinct's commander, a stocky man with a neatly trimmed mustache and an air of authority, greeted him in the hallway. "Agent Harrison," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Chief Rowland. I appreciate you coming in." James shook his hand, his grip firm. "Chief," he said, his tone neutral, "I'm here to ensure what happened yesterday doesn't happen again." Rowland nodded, his expression serious. "I've reviewed the footage and the reports. There's no excuse for what those officers did. I've already initiated mandatory bias training for the entire department, and Daniels and Green will face disciplinary action pending the investigation." "Disciplinary action isn't enough," James said, his voice steady but firm. "This isn't just about two officers making a bad call. It's about a culture that allows bias to go unchecked. That needs to change." Rowland's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "You're right, and I'm committed to making those changes. If you're willing, I'd like your input on how we can improve. Training, protocols, accountability, whatever it takes." James studied him for a moment, searching for any sign of insincerity. But Rowland's gaze was steady, his words genuine. "If you're serious," James said, "I'll help, but I'll be watching closely. This can't just be about optics." "It won't be," Rowland assured him. "I give you my word." That evening, James sat in his car outside the precinct, staring at the sunset painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The day had been long, filled with meetings and difficult conversations, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. His phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Karen. He answered, her voice coming through with a mix of urgency and excitement. "James, we just got word. Victor's operation was bigger than we thought. The evidence we recovered from the van includes ledgers, contacts, and shipment details. We've already made 3 more arrests, and there's more to come." James exhaled slowly, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Good," he said. "That's the kind of result I like to hear." Karen hesitated before adding, "And about the task force, take your time, but think about the lives you could impact. You've already started something here, James. Don't stop now." As the call ended, James leaned back in his seat, staring out at the city skyline. The road ahead was uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure. The fight for justice wasn't over, and he was ready to see it through, no matter how long it took. A new legacy. The morning after his meeting with Chief Rowland, James Harrison stood in the conference room of the FBI field office, a large monitor glowing with a map of the city. Red markers dotted the screen, each representing a location tied to Victor's operation. The evidence recovered from the van had cracked the case wide open. Victor wasn't just a low-level arms dealer. He was part of an international network, smuggling weapons across borders and fueling conflicts around the world. Special Agent Karen Monroe paced the room, briefing the team on the next steps. "Thanks to Agent Harrison's work, we've identified 3 major hubs connected to Victor's network," she said, pointing to the map. "We've already conducted simultaneous raids on 2 of them, resulting in multiple arrests and the seizure of additional contraband. The 3rd hub is our next target, but it's heavily fortified. We'll need to move carefully." James nodded, his focus unwavering. Despite the fallout from his wrongful arrest, he had thrown himself back into the mission with renewed determination. Victor's smirk from the previous day still lingered in his mind, a reminder that the fight wasn't over. "Agent Harrison," Karen said, turning to him, "you'll lead the team on the 3rd raid. Your familiarity with Victor's methods makes you the best person for the job." "Understood," James replied, his voice steady. What's the timeline? 48 hours, Karen said. We're coordinating with Interpol to ensure everything goes smoothly. This will be our final move to dismantle Victor's operation entirely. The room buzzed with quiet energy as the team prepared for the next phase. But as the meeting adjourned and agents filed out, Karen motioned for James to stay behind. Walk with me, she said. They stepped into the hallway, the hum of activity fading behind them. Karen's expression was thoughtful, her usual sharpness softened. James, she began, I know this week has been challenging. Between the mission and what happened with the local police, you've been under a lot of pressure. But I need to ask, what are you thinking about the task force? James exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Honestly, Karen, I'm torn. I've spent my career on the front lines, taking down criminals. It's what I know, what I'm good at. But the incident with Daniels and Green made me realize how deep the problems go. If I can use my position to address those issues, I feel like I have a responsibility to try. Karen stopped walking, turning to face him. You're right, and you'd be the perfect person to lead that charge. But I also know that stepping into a role like this means making sacrifices. You'd be trading the adrenaline of fieldwork for policy meetings and strategy sessions. It's not glamorous, but it's impactful. James met her gaze, his mind churning. He respected Karen's opinion, but the decision felt monumental, as if it would define the trajectory of his career and his legacy. That evening, James found himself back at the precinct, this time for a community meeting organized by Chief Rowland. The room was packed, a mix of local residents, police officers, and community leaders. James stood near the back, observing as Rowland addressed the crowd. We've brought in experts to help us identify the gaps in our training and accountability, Rowland said, his voice firm but conciliatory. We know trust has been broken, and we're committed to rebuilding it. This won't happen overnight. But I want to assure you, change is coming. The crowd's response was mixed. Some nodded in approval, while others murmured skepticism. James understood their hesitation. Words were easy. Action was harder. When Rowland invited community members to share their thoughts, Danielle Carter was one of the first to speak. Standing confidently, she recounted the incident with James and the officers. What happened to Agent Harrison isn't an isolated event, she said, her voice steady but passionate. It's part of a larger problem, and it's up to all of us, police, residents, everyone, to address it. As Danielle spoke, James felt a surge of admiration. Her courage reminded him of why he had chosen this path in the first place. When she finished, the room erupted into applause, and James decided it was time to make his own voice heard. He stepped forward, the room falling silent as he approached the podium. I'm Agent James Harrison with the FBI, he began, his deep voice carrying across the room. 2 days ago, I was detained by officers who assumed I was a criminal based solely on my appearance. I'm not here to vilify those officers, but I am here to demand accountability, not just for me, but for everyone who's been treated unfairly. James paused, letting his words sink in. The issues we're facing aren't new, and they won't be fixed with a single training session or policy change. It's going to take time, commitment, and a willingness to listen to each other. But I believe we can do it, and I'm willing to work alongside all of you to make it happen. The applause was thunderous. James stepped back, his heart steady despite the emotion in the room. As he returned to his seat, Danielle leaned over, her smile bright. That was powerful, she whispered. Thank you for speaking up. James nodded, his expression softening. Thank you for giving me the chance. The next morning, James sat in Karen's office, the sunlight streaming through the blinds. On the desk in front of him was a folder marked Task Force Proposal. Karen sat across from him, her hands folded neatly. So, she said, breaking the silence, what's the verdict? James stared at the folder for a long moment before finally meeting her gaze. I'll do it, he said, but on one condition. I want to stay connected to fieldwork. I need to be on the ground, seeing the impact of our work firsthand. Karen smiled, a rare warmth in her usually sharp demeanor. Done. Welcome to your new role, Task Force Director Harrison. In the weeks that followed, James threw himself into his new responsibilities. The task force quickly took shape, drawing talent from across the Bureau and beyond. Together, they developed initiatives to address systemic bias, improve training, and rebuild trust between law enforcement and the communities they served. But James didn't stay behind a desk for long. He made regular visits to precincts, attended community meetings, and worked alongside officers and residents to tackle issues head-on. His presence was a reminder that real change required collaboration and courage. One evening, as James stood on the steps of a precinct after a long day, his phone buzzed with a message from Danielle. "The work you're doing matters. Keep going." James smiled, slipping his phone back into his pocket. The road ahead was long, but for the first time, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. And as he looked out at the city, its lights glowing against the night sky, he knew one thing for certain: this was just the beginning.